Bone Diddleys, happy Friday, January 12th. If you have not checked in with me yet this week, again, Zoom 140 to 225 or by email, but the email needs to come before the end of the day. That way we're not waiting 2 days for me to respond because I'm not checking my email over the weekend. But check in if you haven't already done so. Today we're going to talk about the Six-Day War, which should be matching up more or less relatively similar to the video that you are watching. And then you're going to knock out the next 25 minutes of the documentary Hope in the Holy Land. Again, you should have already watched up to minute 50 this week. You're watching 50 to 1 hour and 50 minutes. Let's go to it. So the documentary is doing a relatively decent job of explaining to you the conflict really between the Israelis and the Palestinians. We've already talked about background information to this, the religious conflict of it. We've already talked about the religious sites conflict component of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But again, we're going through the conflict as it sets up today, and this is typically about land, right? We're trying to figure out how we've gone from the 1947 partition where the orange area set aside for the Israelis and the yellow areas are set aside for the Palestinians, and the Holy Land of Jerusalem with all of those, pretty important religious sites was supposed to be international. So how do we go from this in 1947 to this right here where the Palestinians have lost a significant amount of land? The only thing that they have is the green, and the city of Jerusalem is more or less possessed by the Israelis. How do they do that? How did this happen? It's an essential component of the conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis. Per our previous conversations, this has happened through conflict. We already talked about the Independence War of 1948 or the 1948 War. Now we're going to talk about the Six-Day War. Six-Day War occurs in 1967, and it is directly connected to another major international conflict that lasted decades during the 1900s, and that's the Cold War. Many of these Arab nations, Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, the Arab nations, many of them allied with the Soviet Union, the USSR. Why do they ally with the Soviet Union? Because the United States was in support of Israel. The United States is a capitalist country. The Soviet Union is a communist country. It makes sense. If the Americans aren't going to listen to us, then we're going to go ally ourselves with their enemy, the U.S. enemy, the Soviet Union. The Six-Day War is a long time coming. We're knocking on almost 20 years between the Independence War and the Six-Day War in 1967. There had been some things that had occurred prior to the Six-Day War in 1970 and 1967 that play into this. And this comes down to Egypt. All right. And Egypt affecting the access to trade routes by water for the Israelis. If I were to zoom in here, the southern tip of Israel has a water port. They have a shipping port on the Gulf of Eilat. The Gulf of Eilat connects to the Red Sea, and obviously we know that the Red Sea will work its way through the Gulf of Suez and through the Suez Canal. The Egyptians from time to time are playing around with blocking the Israeli access to international water routes for trade. Because of this, they did it in the 1950s. We got that handled. They do it again in the 1960s, and because they're putting more or less blockades on Israeli shipping, specifically in the Straits of Tiran down here. Here's the Strait of Tiran. You can see my cursor. The Israelis launch an attack. They are the ones that go to war with Egypt. They will invade the Sinai Peninsula, trying to get the Egyptians to stop blocking their shipping routes. Very much like the Independence War. The Israelis have a much better equipped, trained military than the rest of the Arab nations around them. Okay. So the Israelis are going to gain the Sinai Peninsula. They're going to roll roughshod through the Egyptian forces here. They will regain the East Bank as well as the West Bank and East Jerusalem. They'll take this back from the Jordanians, and then they will take the Golan Heights region up here from Syria. This is a reboot of the Independence War. The Independence War, the war of the 1948 war, is the Israelis versus the Egyptians, the Syrians, the Lebanese, and the Jordanians. 1967 Six-Day War. It's the same thing all over again, except the territory that the country of Israel had lost in the Independence War, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The Israelis are able to get those territories back. They regain the West Bank, they regain control of the Gaza Strip, and they'll take two more additional pieces of land, the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights right here, right? The significance of this war, beyond the acquisition of more territory, is that the Arab nations and the Palestinians realize that they are not going to be able to handle traditional military combat, traditional wars with the Israeli military. They just can't keep up. They're bigger, faster, stronger. They're better equipped. Because of this realization, because they just got their butts whipped for the second time, these groups are going to start turning to terrorism. And it's in 1967 that we start seeing the first examples of Islamic terrorism popping up. Initially, it's going to more or less be focused right around this region. If they can't handle the Israeli military, then they're going to more or less attack civilians in almost like guerrilla style warfare fashion. They can't do open battlefields. They can't keep up with the Air Force, the tanks, ground forces. They're going to turn to these quick, sudden attacks, and then they're going to get out of the situation so they can keep their numbers. But we start to see this begin after the Six-Day War, and it'll slowly escalate. It'll slowly escalate in size. It'll slowly escalate in damage, and it'll slowly escalate in increased frequency, not just in this region, but around the world. I mean, this is the beginning of terrorism as we know it in the 21st century. It all begins here after the Six-Day War, because the Arabs and the Palestinians realize they're not going to keep up with the Israelis. We have one more conflict to cover, the Yom Kippur War, but I'll save that for next week. You guys have the next 25 minutes of the video to watch, minutes 50 through minute 1 hour 15. Make sure you check in. If you have any questions, shoot me an email. But I'll see you guys next week. So have a great weekend. Go Spartans.